You're using a rather big glass for your champagne, not the flute, but more of a white wine glass?
This is the standard now in France. It's called a champagne tulip because you can kind of get your nose in there a little bit better than a very thin flute. And it also is tall enough that it's still going to hold on to carbonation. Whereas a coupe, your champagne will go flat quickly because the bubbles don't have far to go to get out of the glass. So this is kind of a happy medium. You're getting a lot of aroma, but it's still holding on to carbonation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I advise people to at least use a white wine glass, not a flute, because it's still wine. I still like to swirl it and smell it, and I think you can get more enjoyment than just sipping out of a flute. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 264. What's the difference between tasting wine and beer when you want to identify specific aromas and flavors? What are some of the similarities and differences between a Cicerone, or a beer sommelier, and a wine sommelier? And how do retronasal aromas give you a different, deeper sense of the aromas of both beer and wine? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with Mandy Naglich, who has just published How to Taste, a guide to discovering flavor and savoring life. You don't need to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but I hope you'll go back to it if you missed it after you finish this one. 2 of you are going to win a copy of her beautiful hardcover book. All you need to do is email me and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose 2 people randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I wanted to mention some of the recent winners of the books that we've been giving away on the podcast, as well as some other books that you can still win. Craig Haynes in Ottawa has won Vignette, Stories of Life and Wine in 100 Bottles by Jane Lopes. Steph Swenson in Vancouver has won a copy of Luke Whittall's book, The 50 Must-Try Wines in BC. I still have 3 copies of Vintage Crime, A Short History of Wine Fraud by Master of Wine Rebecca Gibb to give away, so let me know if you'd like to win one of these, or Mandy's book, or both. By the way, you don't have to live in Canada like the most recent winners do. Before we dive into our chat with Mandy, I wanted to share a review of my own book, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, from a very nice person on Amazon whose name I don't know, but who spread a little kindness with these words. I very much enjoyed this book. I thought it would be mostly about wine and the wine world, and much of it is, but it was more about one woman's quest into self-discovery after a painful divorce and the horrible online misogynistic bullying attack that happened at the same time, of course. On top of that, it is a beautifully written book. I ordered her other books immediately after I finished this one, with a touch of levity provided by wine and food pairings throughout. I highly recommend this book to anyone who enjoys great writing, has been through a breakup, and likes to learn about wine. Thank you, nice person. If you've read the book or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you haven't got your copy yet and would like to support it and this podcast that I do on a volunteer basis, please order it from any online book retailer, no matter where you live. Every little bit helps spread the message in this book of hope, justice, and resilience. It makes for a wonderful stocking stuffer or holiday gift book. I'll send you beautiful, personally signed book plates for every copy that you buy. Just email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'll also put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/264. Okay, on with the show. So is Cicerone the beer equivalent of sommelier for wine?
It's very similar. So I think sommelier is a little bit more service and hospitality focused. For Cicerone, we do have to know beer pairing and menu development, but it's very focused on serving as far as building those beer systems, to serve carbonated things and being able to brew. So I also am a winner of the national homebrew competition. So I've definitely nailed brewing myself.
Yeah. Tell us about that. Like, when was this and how many entries? What got you going into that?
Yeah, so I won in 2016. I had been brewing for, I think it was close to 4 or 5 years at the time, but I'd never entered a competition. I just moved up to New York and the national homebrew competition was in Baltimore. And at kind of the urging of some people, we went ahead and entered. And yeah, it's 3,000 brewers, 5,000 entries down there. So yeah, my French Saison came out on top. And then since then, I've also gotten some medals for my Belgian Golden Strong and Imperial Stout.
That is remarkable. Did you ever think of commercializing a brand under your name?
I've definitely been approached about that. But the thing I love about journalism and writing is like I can kind of follow my curiosities wherever they go. And I think I would very quickly, it's just not my, like, working on one thing until it's perfect every single day is not something that sounds that fun to me, honestly.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so what got you into home brewing? Like, was beer on the table as a child? Like, what drew you to beer itself?
I think it's that it's a little bit of a lower entry than making something like wine at home. It's also something that, on a college budget, I was more, experienced in drinking. But yeah, it was just something that was pretty easy to do. And once you kind of do 1 or 2 batches and you already see how it's improved so much as you've learned, I really got obsessed with, first of all, trying to recreate beers that I loved. And I wanted them to taste exactly the same. I'd have everyone taste them side by side, blind, mine and the professional one. And so that's a little bit different than wine and things like spirits that change through the years. Wine, each vintage is going to be different. There's no kind of recreating something that you love as in the same way as beer is so consistent year after year after year.
Right.
So.
Huh. Wow. And is there anything that you've discovered since writing this book that you might add to a new edition or might inspire your next book?
There was so much about tasting and our health that wasn't able to make it into the book just because it would be so long. But the more I talked to researchers about how our memories is very closely tied to what we taste and smell, and that really the earliest sign of things like dementia and Parkinson's is probably just a slight dullness of what we're smelling, but we don't really test for that. There's no, when you go to a physical, no one's going to say, oh, are bananas smelling the same to you?
Yeah.
And even if it changed a little, it's not something you would notice right away. But a lot of people were saying, they really think a smell test should be part of your physical. Just as soon as we start to see that fall off, start looking for neurological issues or asking about other aspects of life. Because when you're comfortable, it's so easy to say, oh, maybe things don't smell as sharp. Oh, maybe I'm forgetting things, but it's not something you think to tell your doctor right away and things like that. And also because of the pandemic and the impact on taste and smell research or the funding there, after people were so worried about losing their sense of smell, they're getting a lot more funding. And there might be a potential in the future that it also works the opposite way. They saw people with really large olfactory bulbs were less likely to be affected by COVID as far as symptomatic intensity. So there's potential that if you really are going out there, keeping those senses strong, keeping that olfactory bulb large, that it can actually help you hold on to memory. Now, there's no science done on that, but it's things that people are really excited about studying, and there could be a potential connection there if they can prove it.
That is so interesting.
So,
wow.
Yeah, I'm definitely keeping my eye on all of that research because that would be just one more reason that we should all be tasting and smelling and appreciating what we eat every day that can help us hold on to our memories.
Fantastic. All right. So you have a beer and a wine with you today. Maybe tell us about them. Which one would you like to start with?
Yeah, let's start with the wine. I have this fun, small, if anyone's on video, you can see this little tiny Pommery. I love
It's very cute. It's like there was a time back in the day when models would be sipping on them from straws or whatever. But it's like a 200 ml, is it? Really small size or maybe even less. I don't know.
Yeah, really small. I know the label's kind of wrinkled on it. 187 exactly.
Yes. Okay. And we'll put a link to these in the show notes for those who are listening to the podcast.
Yeah, I have the full size here too, but if I'm just going to be alone, I don't really need
like full. Me and mini me.
Yeah, exactly.
And why did you choose this wine?
So I'm a huge fan of sparkling wine as an aperitif, as I really think everything with carbonation, it's probably coming from my beer background that I love carbonation so much. but I love sparkling wine and I love very, very dry wine. And Pommery is the first, they claim to be the first extra brut out there. So I've always really liked them. I'm going to do a little pop.
Good.
Hopefully it's
a nice,
not too loud.
We like sound effects.
Yeah. Here we go.
There you go. Just a little sigh.
Pretty little pop on such a small bottle. But yeah, and I love like the history of the area of Champagne and how to make real champagne. I love that, women are such a big part of how we started riddling and things like that. The whole
starting that. And then Louise Pommery, as you said, exporting. I think it was the British market that wanted the first dry version of champagne. Yes. They called it sauvage or brut because it was kind of savage taste of the British. They wanted it dry. They made it in France in 1874, and then it made it, once they felt like it was all good, it made it over to England in 1879 was when it really took over the market. And now that's kind of, I think, what we all look for. A lot of people like a very dry sparkling wine. I love a brut nature, like the very, very dry, but extra brut's always Which is drier, extra brut or brut nature?
Brut nature is as dry as it gets. So they don't add any sugar back to it.
So it's natural,
ferments all the way down to 0.
Dry. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so extra brut will be like, I think it's 3 grams is the max on that. And then brut's 10 or something like that.
So if they don't add any sugar to natural, how did they get the second fermentation in the bottle?
I think it's just when they decide to cap it. So if there's still some residual in
the wine itself, it's
not totally done fermenting.
Good. Yeah. Cool. And now you're using a rather big glass for your champagne, not the flute, but more of a bowl white wine kind of glass?
So this is really the standard now in France. It's called a champagne tulip because 2 reasons. One is you can kind of get your nose in there a little bit better than something like a very thin flute. And it also is just tall enough that it's still going to like hold on to carbonation. Flutes are so great for that really beautiful carbonation and keeping it carbonated. Whereas a coupe, your champagne will go flat quite quickly because the bubbles don't have far to go to get out of the glass. So this is kind of a happy medium. These are from the Perrier-Jouet Champagne House. But I was just in Champagne the last 2 summers, actually.
Yes.
Lucky me. And this has really shifted into what everyone's serving out of because of that balance of you're getting a lot of aroma, but it's still holding on to carbonation.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. I advise people to at least use a white wine glass, not a flute, because it's still wine. Mm-hmm. I still like to swirl it and smell it. And I think you can get more enjoyment than just sipping out of a flute.
Absolutely. I talked to Maximilian Riedel in the book, and he cannot stand the flute for anything. He's like, when you think of a Blanc de Noir, he's like, would you pour a red wine into this flute and then try to smell it? Like, you absolutely wouldn't. He's like, I don't know why you would treat champagne this way. So
he said with a scorn in his voice. Yes.
Yeah.
So what do you get from that Pommery Pop baby champagne?
Yeah, I really love this one because there's a lot of champagnes that have a little funk to them or like interesting things going on. But I really think Pommery, their classic one, is just really cheerful and kind of like bright green apple note. And then, of course, the toasted brioche that you're getting on a typical champagne. A little maybe like almonds going on.
And do you know if that is a blend of the 3 major grapes, Chardonnay, Pinot Meunier, Pinot Noir, or is it mostly Chardonnay in there?
That's a good question. It does not say. Yeah, because if it said Blanc to Blanc, I would know. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't say anything on there. So I'm guessing maybe there's a little bit of the 3. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm not totally sure on this one.
And does it,
But yeah, it's a great like celebration. I feel like champagne that's like kind of just great that's why I have all these tiny ones. Because I just think it's, no matter what your palate is, it's not too sweet. It's not too kind of interesting and funky. Like I really love like obviously a Krug if you can get it, but it has that kind of almost blue cheesy note to it that I love. But a lot of people find a little intense for a champagne. It's just really cheerful, bright, palm fruits, almonds, little toasted brioche going on.
Some of those notes are bitter. Like I love Krug too, but the blue cheese, toasted almonds, you're a super taster. So have you accommodated or just developed a taste for that? Or they just don't come off as bitter inside, in the context of champagne for you?
Yeah, I think it's definitely just also becoming a more adventurous eater. What we're exposed to over and over again is something that it becomes a little bit more part of our flavor vocabulary, if you will. I don't know if you can see behind me. Oh, I guess I don't have it up there, but I love like Boulevardiers and Negronis, which are very, very bitter drinks. Have some Amaros back there.
Okay.
So definitely with exposure, you can come
You've
comfortable
come a long
with that.
way from that childhood picky eater. Yes.
Yes. I used to love pork chops and mashed potatoes.
That was it.
Like this.
I can identify with that. And so what beer do you have there?
Oh yeah, this one is fun. I actually switched it up at the last minute, but it's from
Okay.
Allagash. It's called Two Lights. And the reason I picked it is because it's made with Sauvignon Blanc grape must. So I thought we'll blend our wine worlds and our
Sure.
beer
And
worlds a little
Allagash, is
bit
that the
here.
brand or a region?
Allagash is the brand. So it's a region up in
Okay.
just outside of Portland, Maine. But the actual, brewery, it's one of the older breweries that we have in the US. They started in 1995. I did a little book event with them, so I learned a lot about them. But one thing I love about beer is just like, you can see this beautiful white head that it maintains. When I was pouring my champagne, you'll see a head like that form, but it doesn't have the protein to hold on to it at all, right? So you see that little bit of foam and then it has to dissipate. But because of the protein that we have in malts, you get this beautiful like mousse on top that I just think looks so pretty when you're serving it with things. I have like a little tiku glass here that I think really also accentuates the head on it.
Okay, so where does the protein come from in beer?
It comes from the malt.
Okay, from the malt. All right. So that creates that structure. Okay.
Right. And you can add, if you want to add something like flaked wheat or flaked oats, that will up that protein even more. If you've heard of a German beer style called a Hefeweizen, they have these huge heads, like it would be filling this glass, and they really can maintain it because it has a ton of wheat in it that has all that protein that's just holding on, basically capturing the bubbles like a net, holding on to it, and making that beautiful head that stays around.
And do you like that, being able to taste it within the foam, the head, as well as then the beer itself, the more liquidy part? Like, does it give you two different taste experiences?
It definitely does. If you ever wanted to like try to have a spoonful of just the head and then the beer, you'll definitely notice a lot more bitterness in the head. So what's happening with those proteins, they're also bonding with some of the acids from hops. So you're going to get some of that hoppy bitterness there. That's going to be more bitter than the body of the beer. But two different experiences, but you can usually drink right through it. So you're getting a little, it's kind of like frosting on a cake, right? You're getting a little of the frosting with your sip, but you're not typically eating just the frosting itself with a spoon. So,
well, some of us might, but that's okay. That's not what we're supposed to do. And so I'm just watching you here. Do you swirl your beer when you go to, like, the way you would a wine to taste a beer?
Yeah. So chapter 4 of the book outlines the tasting method, which is a 7-step method that I had a bunch of different experts from cheese to beer, wine, sake weigh in on and just make sure that it made sense with whatever you were tasting. So really, I taste everything exactly the same way. A little bit of swirling is great just because you're knocking those aroma compounds out of solution to get them up to your nose. But you don't want to over swirl. These two beverages are perfect not to over swirl because you're also going to swirl the carbonation right out of your drink.
Right.
So what I really suggest to people is, wait till you have your last 3 or 4 sips left and then do a covered swirl where you'll put your hand on top of the glass, swirl it. And what's happening is under that hand is all the aroma compounds are being forced into that headspace. So you're really going to swirl the crap out of it. I say you're swirling the flavor all out. You're going to align your nose with your hand and then lift your hand and take a sniff. And it's my favorite part of my book tour when we do tasting together because everyone goes together, whoa.
I love that.
Because it really makes it this like potent aroma under there. But the thing is, whatever's left in your glass basically has no flavor left in it because you swirled it all out.
Even if it's not carbonated, like a flat white wine or a flat red wine, it would dissipate the aromas out of it as well?
Yep. So basically you're swirling all of those compounds out of solution and gathering them in the headspace. It wouldn't be quite as much maybe, but you'll definitely notice a flatness to what you taste. It also warms it up when you're doing a ton of swirling like that, like 5 seconds of concentrated swirling on just a little bit left in the glass.
Right.
You'll notice a flatness when it's over because all of those compounds are what you're tasting. So they all got swirled out into your nose, but it's like a last kiss of flavor that it's really fun whenever you're having something special. If you feel comfortable covering your glass in public and putting your hand on it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Go for it. And also in your book, you talk about orthonasal, which is smelling up front, the way we usually think of smelling a glass of wine or beer, and then retronasal. Talk about retronasal. First, it's coming out the back, but let's go step by step. Do you have to pinch your nose, plug your nose first? What are the steps?
Yeah. So just really quick. Yeah. Retronasal is that pathway up the back of your throat, still hitting that olfactory bulb that's kind of right behind your eye. So what you're trying to do in this is force that aroma out your nose, basically, without getting any of that orthonasal to kind of interfere, right? So to do the best retronasal, where you're truly getting just retronasal aroma, you will pinch your nose, take a breath, take a medium-sized sip, swirl it over your palate, and then keeping your lips closed, you'll exhale out your nose as you swallow, and that's just going to force those aroma compounds up the back of your throat and out your nose. I kind of think about it. If you think of our olfactory receptors like piano keys, right? An orthonasal, you're playing it up, up, up your scales. You can take the exact same notes on a piano and play down the scales, and they just sound a little different, even though it's the same notes, just the opposite order. Yeah. And that's kind of what retronasal gives you a chance, just to reintroduce yourself to the aroma and see when you're playing it backward if you notice anything new. So you don't have to plug your nose. You can kind of just try not to sniff out of it and do that same thing if you feel uncomfortable plugging your nose in public. But I've really been just a quick pinch. No one cares. If you're out to dinner, no one notices.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was just wondering what the purpose was, but I guess you don't want to be breathing in other aromas with the wine when you're first taking it in. You just want just the wine coming in, I guess.
Well, and if you think about, I don't know if you've ever done this with like a Skittle or a Jelly Bean, but when you plug your nose and put it in your mouth and it doesn't taste like that much, and then you let go of your nose and all of a sudden you get all of this flavor. True. That's because about 80% of what we consider flavor is coming from our aroma receptors. Yeah. You know, our palate can only get our 5 basic tastes, so that's not much of flavor. All of the interesting notes that differentiate an orange from a lemon are coming from our nose. So just by plugging that, you're just making sure it's not going to interfere at all until you're exhaling and getting all of that aroma up into your olfactory bulb.
Very cool. And back to your beer, how would you describe it? Yeah. Not only as a beer, but how would you approach a tasting note perhaps differently from what you would with the wine?
Yeah, I actually don't think you need to approach it all that differently. I'm really surprised. I tasted it and it's sweeter than I was expecting. Oh. You definitely get some of that like really sweet grape Sauvignon Blanc to it. It's not as dry as I was expecting as far as the body. For a beer, it's very neutral on the yeast. You can tell it's a lager. It doesn't have a lot of that beer character that I was talking about, like all those esters and phenols and things like that. It's very clean on the nose, other than that little bit of fruit, that little bit of like grape skin going on. It kind of has almost like a grape soda or like a grape jelliness to it, like a white grape soda or something. It's like very, very spritzy.
And do you think tasting the champagne first affects your perception of that beer? Do you think by comparison, the beer is tasting sweeter because the champagne was first?
It might be. I would say we took a couple of minutes in between.
True. So and you've taken a couple sips, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the best palate cleanser is the smell of yourself. So I've definitely, had a couple seconds of that, just plugging my nose and things like that. So I don't think that probably affected it all too much. And I wonder if they were trying to kind of accent the sweetness of this. Because it's kind of like almost like cocktailish happening right now.
And what would you pair with that beer versus the Pommery champagne?
Good question. I mean, both of these are pretty low intensity drinks. Okay. So I think the number one rule when it comes to pairing is making sure your intensities match. So you don't want the drink to overpower the food or vice versa. I actually think both.
Do you mean the degree of flavor by intensity?
Yeah. So something like this Pommery is just, it has a lot of flavor going on. I was saying almond and green apple and brioche, but they're very delicate flavors. There's something that even I would say something like a chicken could overpower the flavors there. They're very delicate. So it would be something kind of, I would say like maybe like a neutralish goat cheese with some honey and like maybe a nice piece of toasted brioche would be nice to kind of accent those flavors in the Pommery. The intensity of the two lights from Allagash is a little bit more, especially that sweetness coming through and those notes of grape. So it could be fun with like a summer salad with some kind of fruit on it, maybe some like strawberries and balsamic and maybe a little goat cheese on there too. But like some of like the herbalness of the salad, I think you can get as like a secondary or third note, some tropical hops going on here. So you could accent that bitterness maybe with some bitter greens and some fruit and balsamic.
Yeah, that sounds like a great pairing. And then you were talking about another beer somewhere where the pairing of, I think it was a German lager and a sharp cheese created a new taste or flavor sensation. What was happening there?
Yeah, so a very malt-forward beer, like a dark German beer, like a Schwarzbier or a dark mild from England, and then a sharp cheddar, they kind of come together to create this experience like you're having a grilled cheese. It's also the same with a very jammy wine and something like a sweet peanut brittle, and you kind of get the peanut butter and jelly combination going on. Yeah, using the beverage and food to kind of come together and recreate a memory or another dish is a really fun way to play with flavors and pairings rather than maybe always thinking about intensity and cutting, contrasting, complementing kind of things. It's fun to create something new.
Something new, yeah. And does saying out loud what you're smelling help cement your memory of those aromas better? than just thinking about the aromas or writing them down?
Definitely. So there's something called verbal overshadowing that can really work both ways. It can, if you're saying the wrong note, so say I was smelling this, which smells very, grape and tropical, but I was saying, I don't know, dried fig over again. It can kind of cement things the wrong way. So you really want to do it with an expert where you know that, or you know exactly what's in the beer. Like I know this is Sauvignon Blanc grape, so I could say white grape, white grape, white grape. And that will really tie that verbal cue with the sensory input together in your brain. But yeah, it works both ways. So that's why when you're kind of learning, you want to be careful. If you can, you want to be with an expert or someone who knows, so you can make sure you're making those connections realistically.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't want to say correctly because I don't think anyone tastes incorrectly, but just, maybe you want your foundations to be solid on what is accepted for different notes and things like that. And then, practicing saying things out loud is really helpful. Even like your spice cabinet, you can go to and smell and say cinnamon, 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 and then see if you smell that in a red wine somewhere. And you'll know when it pops up that it's related to cinnamon.
I'm going to try that too. Great tips.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mandy. Let's move to the lightning round. Is there something that you believe about wine about which others might disagree?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Like wine is not my specialty, I will say. Yeah.
So maybe the point is that
just
you should learn
wine.
more about beer than wine. All the wine lovers listening would disagree with that. I'm kidding.
No, I think, and the whole philosophy of the book is like, I really think all tasting and like drinking and experiencing should be a positive experience. So even if there's something I don't like, just adding it to like my tasting vocabulary, I think is important.
Sure.
So maybe it's that. Maybe try everything if you think you won't like it, just to get it in that flavor vocabulary and experience.
Yeah, because it helps to know what you don't like. Like, just like ordering from a restaurant menu. Oh, I'm going to avoid the liver. Thank you very much. Like that's good. That narrows it down the choices.
Then again, I thought I did not like Prosecco because I don't like sweet things typically, but my husband has tricked me several times ordering me glasses of Prosecco when we're out. And I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. So challenge what you think you don't like too. Liver can be delicious.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll pair it with Prosecco or something. I don't know.
There you go.
I don't know if that would work or not. But anyway, now I know you were a picky eater, but do you have a favorite childhood food that you can recall? And today, what would you pair it with wine? Which wine?
Yeah. Like I said, I love a pork chop. So we can stick with that. And I think like that's a pretty low intensity food, like something, if it was really nice and caramelized and had like a really nice crust on it. I could see it going with something like maybe a really full bodied cava, like a sparkling cava could be nice with that. As you can see, I really like sparkling wine. And I also think like, how cava has that more like rough soda pop bubble to it. Right. Usually that's like a nice kind of palate cleanser between bites of pork chop. So I think that could be nice. I think a little caramelization on the pork could bring forward some of those like deeper bready notes of a cava. That could be a really lovely pairing. And two things that I like. That's what I always say when it comes to pairing. There's very few pairings that are so bad that, it's going to make you dislike what you're eating. True. I think if you have two things that you like and they don't overpower each other too much, it's always going to be a pretty decent pairing.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a favorite wine book?
Yes. So I read almost everything electronically. So I have it on my Kindle here, but we actually were talking about it. The Widow Clicquot.
By Pilar Mazio.
Yeah. Yes. And she has another great book about
Chanel?
Ritz Hotel.
The Ritz.
Yeah. The Ritz Hotel in Paris, and about like its occupation. And one of the bartenders is a spy, like for the other side. And it's all factual. So it's amazing. She finds these dramas that are surrounded by hospitality and food and drink and things like that, and really tells them in such a compelling way. I love that book. And then Cork Dork is another one I really
Bianca
like.
Bosker. And we'll link to those in the show notes. Yeah, Pilar, I think she's originally from the States. I think an English lit or creative writing professor, but she now makes wine in BC. So,
I didn't know that.
I didn't until I interviewed her.
Try her wine.
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah, I love that book so much.
It's a great story.
Really, what we were talking about, the history of women in that industry and how much they changed it and didn't follow expectations, and now carved the way for the champagne we love so much.
Absolutely. Do you have a most useful wine gadget that you've come across?
Yes. Oh yeah, here we go. So when I was in France 2 times ago, these like lay flat wine closures for sparkling, they work so much better than any
that
other kind of wine closure I have.
Okay.
Yeah. And they have
lay
like
flat.
These two, and they slip in your pocket.
Convenient.
If you're going on a picnic or something. Yeah. I just love how they're super flat, easy to like, not that expensive. This one's from GH Martel and Sons Champagne House, but They work so well. They work on everything sake as well, the bottles. And yeah, I bought like 5 of them and I love them. So
That's great. We will link to those in the show notes as well as the books that you mentioned so that people can find them.
Yeah.
And if you could share a bottle of wine with any person outside the wine or beer world, who would that be? And which wine would you open?
Question. As a journalist, I went to school for broadcast journalism, but obviously wrote a book in print journalism, but Oprah for sure. I would love to just sit on her back porch with some wine, hear, all of her stories of how she was coming up. And so I respect her so much. And she's like the best interviewer out there.
Yeah, she is great.
It'd be great to have
And do you have a particular wine you'd open with Oprah?
That's a good question. Yeah, it would probably be champagne. Of course. I guess we got a theme here. So I would do maybe a Pommery or I love Paul Roger champagne as well. Something not too flavor intense, just something light to enjoy and celebrate hanging out with another journalist.
And if you could put up a billboard in downtown Manhattan, what would it say?
Something along the lines of stop and smell the roses, but not so cliche maybe. I think that's really the reason I wrote the book is all these artisans, we're enjoying their wine, we're enjoying their cheese, honey, anything. They spend so much time making this for us. And if you're at like a dinner or sharing a cheese plate, you're talking to your friends, we don't ever really take a second to maybe stop and smell the wine, stop and smell the bubbles, and just appreciate, the way they curate the bubbles in a glass of champagne, whether, like I said, it's those big rough bubbles or those really soft bubbles. There's so many aspects that these experts go through. And if you're just drinking your wine and not taking a moment to taste it, I think you're missing out on a lot.
A lot of pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you could have a series of billboards. The first one would say, stop and smell the cinnamon. Then the next one would be, stop and smell the bread. Then stop and smell the... So they get a smell vocabulary, aroma vocabulary.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to mention, Mandy?
No, I think we did pretty good. I would say like my whole philosophy is just learning these little facts, like we were talking at the beginning, that make drinks and hospitality more interesting. And I share a lot of those over on my Instagram, Drinks with Mandy. I have a fun one coming up for National Rum Day tomorrow. But I think the more you know about, those little facts you can share when you first open a wine or have a cocktail and say, oh, if you like cinnamon, you might like this wine a lot. I think just makes it, so much more interesting. So that's really...
It's interesting and it builds anticipation in a good way, I think. It's a great way to wrap a story around whatever you're eating or drinking.
Yeah.
You mentioned Instagram and we'll link to it, Drinks with Mandy. Do you want to mention a website or anything else in terms of how we can find you and the book online?
Yeah, so the book's website is howtotastebook.com. My personal website's mandykn.com, but Instagram's probably the best for finding me. But yeah, anywhere books are sold, you can find How to Taste, a Guide to Discovering Flavor and Savoring Life. I have a copy here. I should
there it is.
Row around.
Yep.
Yeah. And I'm excited a couple of your listeners are going to get a copy that I'll sign.
Absolutely. So they just have to email me, Natalie@nataliemaclean.com, and get a copy to 2 people listening to this or watching the video. Mandy, I'm going to say goodbye. It's been a pleasure to chat with you. Absolutely fascinating. Great insights. Stellar research. So I'm sure this book is going to do very, very well. So congratulations.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fun to taste a couple things together too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I'll say cheers and bye for now, but stay tuned. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Mandy. Here are my takeaways. I was fascinated with Mandy's explanation and demonstration of the differences between tasting wine and beer. I had assumed that the process would be very similar, if not the same, and was surprised to find out that it's not. Number 2, I also found her explanation of the similarities and differences between a Cicerone and a sommelier helpful. I didn't realize that the world of beer is so diverse, yes, my little wine snob eyes have been opened, or that Cicerones are more involved in maintaining complex equipment as compared to sommeliers. 3, I fully support her focus on how retronasal aromas reintroduce you to the richer, deeper aromas of both beer and wine and enable you to discover something new when you're playing it backwards, as she says. And 4, I also agree about using a tulip glass rather than the traditional champagne flute to better swirl and smell the wine. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Mandy, links to her website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. You can also find a link to my free online wine and food pairing class. It's called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com @natalie.com/264. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or if you've read my book or are in the process of reading it at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I would love to hear from you. If you missed episode 175, go back and take a listen. I chat about sommeliers versus cicerones with the host of the Drinks Adventure podcast, James Atkinson. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. What is the difference between a wine sommelier and a beer sommelier or a cicerone, apart from the type of alcoholic beverage?
The title sommelier is not trademarked like Cicerone. No one can call themselves that legally without having completed certification.
Who started the Cicerone organization?
Ray Daniels, a beer professional, got sick of going out to bars and being served a beer and the dirty glass. The beer itself might have been sitting in the keg for too long. It was tired. If you get a bottle of wine, it can withstand a little bit of abuse. But beer, once it's brewed, it starts degrading like immediately. People have this idea that a can of beer is like a can of food, that you put it on the shelf and it doesn't change, but that's really not correct. So Ray was like, we need structured education for professionals.
If you liked this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, beers, tips, and stories we shared. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McClain Wine on their favorite podcast app. You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Amanda Barnes, author of the South American Wine Guide, who will join us from her home in Mendoza, Argentina. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a bubbly or a beer in a white wine glass. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.